They say a man becomes invisible after 60. I learned that a minute before, my son's wife slapped me in front of 100 guests and a rented string quartet, trying to pretend the country club smelled like roses instead of boiled fish. I kept the keys in my pocket where they always live, warm under my palm, the same way a man keeps a final truth he never plans to share, and she said, loud enough to make the champagne flinch, "Martin, give me the apartment keys." Her smile was a knife with frosting, the kind meant for cutting wedding cake, but just as capable of slicing through cartilage if the angle was right. I told her no. Simple, quiet, the same no. I used when my son was 7 and wanted a BB gun. The same no I used when my first boss told me to skip a safety inspection to save a week of paperwork. Some words grow sharper with age. She leaned in, perfume like crushed limes and ambition, and she slapped me hard enough to rattle the little bones in my ear, hard enough that the sound inside my head was like a flagpole rope in the wind. My son stood beside her, tuxedo tight across a gym-built chest, too stunned or too trained to do anything but blink. Years of etiquette classes, corporate dinners, and networking luncheons had taught him how to smile through anything, but even polished marble cracks when the foundation shifts. The photographer captured it. I saw the pop of the flash, a tiny exploding star meant for the photo album they'd show their future children, who would one day ask why Grandpa's face looked like he'd been hit by thunder. The crowd made that low human noise herds make when lightning hits a fence, confusion wrapped in curiosity, half alarm, half entertainment. Faces leaned in, champagne paused halfway to painted mouths, pearls and cufflinks glittering like predators' eyes in tall grass. I did not lift my hand. I did not move. I said in a voice that only a few people around us could hear, "That's your one free one." The words left my mouth like coins dropped into a well. Quiet, but eventually someone was going to hear them hit the bottom. She laughed. She was 30 and thought cruelty was clever, thought youth was a currency that never lost value, thought the world's gears would always turn in her direction as long as she smiled and sharpened her words. The room went still, except for the cappuccino machine, steaming in the bar, like a train about to pull out, a reminder that, even when humans pause, machines keep working. I turned to my son. "Brandon," I said. His name came out heavier than I meant, like a stone you drop because you finally admit it's been hurting your hand. He touched his cufflink, custom silver engraved with his initials, a gift from me on the day he passed the bar exam. He would not meet my eyes. "Lila and I need to put everything in one basket, Dad," he said, repeating a line that sounded borrowed from someone who had never carried a basket in their life. "That's what families do." "Families," I said, "wasps nest in nicer houses." He didn't laugh. He didn't even breathe differently. My son, who once used to race down the stairwell, laughing just because we'd made pancakes on a school day, now looked at me like I was a wall he needed to legally remove. The notary smiled. Professional as a lamppost, he lifted a page with polite fingers. "This is a standard transfer of keys and temporary power of attorney for property management," he said, voice trained to be calm in the presence of sharks. A man who had notarized too many wills, too many divorces, too many quiet betrayals disguised as signatures. If a conscience lived in him, it paid rent and slept on the floor. I touched my cheek where the heat was leaking out of the handprint. I looked at the ceiling. The venue had iron chandeliers and fake Edison bulbs to make rich people feel like pioneers with indoor plumbing, as if electricity became more authentic when it pretended to struggle through filaments. The walls were lined with photographs of long club founders, stern men with silver hair and small smiles that suggested they still owned everything in the room, including the oxygen. When my father died, he left me a portfolio that looked shabby and old-fashioned. Land nobody wanted. I never talked about it. When you work 30 years as a building inspector, you learn that the strongest beams are the ones no one notices, and the ones everyone mocks today are the ones that'll still be standing when the glass towers fall. I lived below my means, ate at diners that gave free refills, fixed my own faucets, and never once explained to anyone why I stayed in the same modest brick house, even after I could have afforded marble floors and a view of the bay. People think humility is lack. Sometimes it's just camouflage. I took out my phone. I said, into it, "Colton, I need you here now." The call took 4 seconds. That was all it ever took with Colton. If he answered, the world shifted. I put the phone away and returned my hand to my pocket, feeling the keys like a pulse. Lila laughed again and shook the folded paper near my mouth like she was feeding me it. "Sign," she said. The notary held out a pen, the kind that looked expensive and bled ink like regret. I said, "No." That word again, simple, small, but forged in something older than money or court filings. She slapped me again, quick this time, like a second thought, like she was swatting a fly that wouldn't move. The room gasped the way people do when they realize the line between entertainment and cruelty just disappeared. I didn't flinch. My son flinched for me. That was maybe the last time he did anything on my behalf. I said, "Last warning." She said, "I'm family now." She said it like it meant she had sovereign rights over my skin, my house, my bones. She said it like family was a legal title that erased history instead of built on it. The doors to the ballroom opened, and a man walked in with the plain seriousness of rain coming over a cut hayfield. His suit didn't shine. His face had the kind of calm that makes people remember funerals. The bridal party saw him and started to cry. Not because they knew him, but because human skin knows a storm when it walks in wearing leather shoes. You can train people to ignore a lot: poverty, pain, the truth, but the body always recognizes danger. Colton nodded at me, like we'd just finished loading a truck. He looked at my cheek, then at Lila, then at the notary, in the order a surgeon examines an infection. Source, spread, containment. He said, "You should put that pen away." The notary did. He tucked it back into its velvet slot, like it was suddenly radioactive. The man had probably notarized documents signed by embezzlers, murderers, families tearing themselves apart for lake houses and coin collections. But something about Colton told him this was different. This wasn't paperwork. This was weather. People started whispering, but whispers are just cowardly questions. They wanted to know who he was. They wanted to know what would happen. They wanted to know if this was still a wedding, or if they were now witnesses to a different kind of ceremony, the kind where vows are broken instead of made. Lila stiffened. Her smile faltered, but only for a second. Predators learn early not to show fear. She said, "You can't threaten us. This is a legal situation." Colton didn't blink. He said, "Legal is a word people use when they ran out of moral." Brandon tried to speak, tried to insert himself like a mediator at a hostage negotiation. "Dad," he started, but his voice cracked at the word, not from emotion, from strain. From the realization that maybe the man he'd always assumed was soft had simply been unprovoked. I said, "Brandon, you invited me here to bless your marriage. Instead, you tried to rob me in front of strangers. There was a time you'd have known better than to mix those two events." He closed his mouth. Sometimes silence is the only honest reply. Lila stepped forward, hands on her hips, chin high. She said, "You can't scare me." Colton's eyes softened the way a lion's do before it stands up. He said, "I'm not here to scare you. I'm here to remind you that some people still have consequences." Outside, a wind picked up, rattling the tall windows, and for a moment it sounded like applause from ghosts. The string quartet packed their instruments without being told, musicians always knowing when the show has changed form. I reached into my pocket and finally pulled the keys out. They jingled, small metal sounds that seemed too light to carry so much weight. I held them in my palm, looked at my son and said, "You thought I kept these because I was sentimental. I kept them because I always knew there'd be a day someone tried to take what wasn't theirs. You didn't inherit my money. You inherited my caution, and you threw it away." He looked at the keys like they were burning. Maybe they were. Truth tends to heat metal. Lila opened her mouth to speak, but Colton took one step forward. Just one, enough to turn her throat dry. The notary shuffled backward until he hit a table of petite fours. I said, "I'm leaving now. If you want to talk like family, you know where to find me. If you want to act like thieves, then hire better ones next time." I put the keys back in my pocket, not slowly, not dramatically, just with the ease of someone who knows he's already won. Colton held the door for me. The man even bowed his head a little, like respect was currency he handled carefully. I walked out without looking back, because only the guilty look back to check the damage. And as I crossed the hallway lined with portraits of men who thought they'd built legacies in wood and stone, I thought about invisibility. They say a man becomes invisible after 60. Maybe that's true. But sometimes invisibility isn't a curse. Sometimes it's cover. Sometimes it's the cloak you wear, while everyone else forgets you still know how to burn their house down. Slowly, legally, and without ever lifting your hand. Outside, the sky was grey, the good kind, the kind that promised rain and quiet, and the smell of earth turning honest again. Colton matched my pace. He didn't ask what came next. Men like him don't need to. They understand that storms don't explain themselves. I touched my cheek again, the sting fading, replaced by something cleaner. Clarity. My son had made a choice. His wife had made a promise she didn't understand. And I had finally remembered that being underestimated is the last privilege age gives a man, and the most dangerous one to take advantage of. I unlocked my car, old but polished, engine still humming like it believed in me. Before I got in, Colton said, "Want me to stay close?" I said, "No. Not yet. Let them think the weather passed." He nodded. I drove off, slow, steady, the kind of exit people don't applaud because they don't realize it was the beginning, not the end. And somewhere, back in that ballroom full of borrowed flowers and rented music, the second slap was still floating in the air, waiting to land on the right person. How we got here, I am not a genius. I'm a patient man who learned to count hairline cracks. I did it in basements that flooded twice a year and in penthouses that hid mold behind paintings with gold frames. My marriage broke under the slow stress of small things that never got fixed. My ex-wife, Evelyn, said I spent more time talking to concrete than to her. Maybe she was right. We divorced without lawyers taking the furniture, which is a kind of miracle. My father died 3 years ago. I hired the only attorney I ever trusted and did one thing that felt like a sin in a family. I did not tell my children. Brandon and my daughter, Claire, had grown allergic to the smell of honest work. They liked results, not reasons. We are an Instagram nation now. Brandon met Lila at a real estate breakfast where everyone had white teeth and debt piled like wedding cakes. She wore ambition like a diamond. She understood that a broke father can be a slow leak in a marriage. She also understood an old man with old habits might be sitting on old money. When she moved in with my son, I started getting texts like jokes with knives in them. "Dad, you should enjoy the city more. Maybe move someplace safe. Maybe closer to us. Keys are a burden at your age." I sent a thumbs up. The way you signal you read something without accepting its terms. Then the wedding. The planning had the energy of a small coup. I offered to pay for the things that would be invisible in photos, like parking attendants and extra servers. Lila thanked me and then doubled the flower budget. By the time the day arrived, I felt like a contractor who knows a load-bearing wall is about to be removed by people who think gravity has a sense of humor. A week before, Lila arrived at my apartment with a man who smelled like hotel lobby air and asked for a quick notarized signature to help with seating charts. I told them to leave. She smiled and said it would be easier at the wedding. The apartment itself is the unused tip of an iceberg. It sits on a street of old brick where you can still hear the city breathe through the window frames. I keep it spare. One chair, one table. I have other places. I have land outside the ring roads, and little bits of other buildings, the way a gardener has cuttings rooting in jars on every windowsill. You don't talk about cuttings. You watch them. You prune. I told Evelyn only the outline of it. She said, "You don't trust them." I said, "I love them." When the notary showed up at the wedding, he tried the tone you use with a confused patient. He explained that the keys would remain in family, that it was temporary, that Brandon and Lila would merely coordinate contractors. I said, "I have spent my life keeping contractors honest." He said, "Then you will have no trouble signing." I took a breath that felt like stepping down onto a ladder rung to test it. Then I made the call. Colton and I met years ago when a mezzanine collapsed in a discount club that sold televisions the size of beds. My report forced the owners to refit the whole structure. It shut them down for 2 months. People cursed me on the radio, but a security team on site was spared because they were not standing where they usually stood. They were where Colton put them that day because he had read my inspection schedule and trusted I was not an idiot. He sent me a letter after, a real letter. We had coffee once a year after that. We never talked about the collapse. We talked about who shows up when it matters. He showed up now. Colton moved into the space between me and the crowd with the "what are we doing" face a good foreman wears when a crane is swinging a little too hot. Lila adjusted her smile. She said, "This is a family moment," Colton said, "and I'm here to keep it that way." Then he looked at the notary and said, "Where's your commission card?" The man produced it, and Colton took a picture of it with the casual authority of someone who can make your day long or short. Then he handed it back and said, "You can stay, but you're a witness now, not a participant. If you hand over that pen again, you leave." The notary said nothing. Brandon tried on a pleading face. "Dad," he said, "come on. We just want to organize things." I said, "I've been organized since before you were born." Lila said, "You're being dramatic, Martin." I said, "You were dramatic when you hit me. You were stupid when you did it next to a photographer." For a breath, the room tilted. I could feel the crowd waiting for a scene like they wait for dessert. People love public hurt. It tastes like someone else's cake. Colton leaned close. He said, "We can walk away or we can teach a lesson." I said, "I've been teaching for 30 years. Class is in session. Public collapse is often a series of tiny clicks. People imagine explosions. Really it is, screws backing themselves out one thread at a time. I let my kids pull. I let them believe they were loosening something. I let them feel the satisfying give of a bolt turning without ever noticing the nut on the other side had already been removed. That is the trouble with children raised around comfort. They think everything that moves does so because of them. The day after the wedding, I got a text from Claire. "Dad, call me," it said, with a heart that looked like a bruise. She always used the heart emoji like it was a tourniquet, something applied after the wound, never before. She came by with oatmeal cookies and the tone of a nurse about to take a pulse, "You will fail." The cookies were still warm, still soft in the middle, the kind she used to make for grade school bake sales, when her biggest worry was whether someone else's mother would bring the same recipe. Time doesn't just move forward, it erodes sideways. She said, "Brandon is worried you're angry." She said, "Lila was stressed." She said it like stress was a weather pattern that excused behavior, like hurricanes come with handwritten notes. "Sorry for the mess, we were emotional." She reached for my key bowl without looking at it, the way a person who grew up in a safe house reaches for her toothbrush in a hotel bathroom. That unconscious reach, that assumption of access, told me everything. I slid the bowl away. I didn't make a sound doing it, just a slow pull across the counter, the ceramic whispering against the wood. That small move told her we were not playing in the shallow end, that there were depths here she didn't know how to swim in. She took her hand back and folded it into the other and said, "I'm just trying to help." I told her a story about a staircase that squeaked on the left side because the carpenter missed the stud and filled the gap with a shim. She nodded without understanding, thinking I was talking about wood and nails instead of inheritance and intent. I said, "Claire, how much student debt do you have?" She said, "Some." I said, "I can smell some." Her eyes flicked down, then up, the way liars and people in love both do. She tried to smile. "Dad," she said, "Brady and I are fine." She said it too quickly, like someone proving they weren't out of breath. I said, "Good." That night, Colton and I drew a map on my kitchen table. The paper was an old plot plan from a parcel I owned just outside the Beltway, a place so unremarkable no one had looked at it twice in 40 years. He brought a pen that writes like it has a small engine in it, the kind you refill with cartridges instead of ink, because men like him don't believe in improvisation. We listed everything my kids believed I owned, and everything they did not know I owned, and the thin ice between those two lakes. The list grew like a spine, vertebrae of properties, bonds, shares, deeds, favors owed, contracts half forgotten, but still binding. My attorney had already moved the big pieces into a trust that was so boring you could fall asleep pronouncing its name. Trusts are like safes. The sturdy ones are ugly, heavy, and designed to be ignored. The surface story still showed an apartment, a commercial unit with a stubborn tenant, and a smattering of bonds you'd cross the street to avoid. A decoy portfolio. Perfectly plausible. Deeply unimpressive. Colton said, "They'll go after what they can see." I said, "Let them." We planned a demonstration, not of force, of carelessness, a staged weakness, an amateur crack, the kind that invites someone to think they are smarter than you. We would make a problem that would invite them to pretend to be helpful, and in pretending, they would leave fingerprints on decisions. I told Colton I would never set my kids up for prison. He said, "Prison is not the point, loss is the point, and loss is a teacher that doesn't use chalk." He arranged a break-in, not a wild one, not a movie scene, a real one. Quiet. Someone would pry the back door, move 3 things an amateur would move, and leave. No smashed glass, no spray paint, no theatrics. Just enough to create a narrative of vulnerability. We would invite Brandon to be the hero. Heroes rush in. Heroes sign things. When the pry bar squealed against my door, Colton and I sat in my truck 2 blocks away and listened on a microphone no fancier than the old baby monitor I used 25 years ago. At 11:04 p.m., I texted Brandon, short and sweet, "Someone's in my place." He replied in seconds, "On my way." Rich kids respond to emergencies like they're late for yoga, eager, righteous, unable to imagine they're walking into choreography. He arrived fast, with his chest inflated and his mouth tight. He had a friend with him who I did not know but recognized by posture. The friend was a man who liked to be near rich people. His kind always stand half a step behind, waiting for dropped crumbs or dropped names. He carried a tiny flashlight that tapped the wall like he was knocking on a vault that should already be open. We went inside. The intruder was gone. Drawers askew, 2 cheap watches missing. Not the good ones in the safe, just the ones someone would think were good. Brandon said, "Jesus, Dad, this building is a mess." He said it with the voice of a man who wants to replace the floor when the problem is the roof. The kind of man who thinks peeling paint and structural rot are the same genre of issue. Colton walked in a minute later, wearing a windbreaker with security on the back that had probably been printed that afternoon. He nodded to Brandon like they had met before. Brandon's friend vanished into the hallway like a bad idea escaping responsibility. Colton said, "We need emergency authority to secure this unit, to hire a locksmith, and to coordinate patrols." Temporary. 48 hours. "Sign here, Dad." It was a real, clean form, drafted by my attorney with the kind of language only old men and judges like. Brandon looked relieved, like he had arrived at the step he'd hoped for, the step where he becomes necessary. I signed my name on the first line. Then I slid the pen to Brandon. I said, "If you want to coordinate, you sign here acknowledging you accept responsibility for any contractors you bring in, or any commitments you make." He didn't read it. He signed with a flourish like an athlete signing a jersey. Colton watched the pen like a hawk watches a rabbit that has decided the sky is decorative. The locksmith arrived 10 minutes later. He was real. He changed the locks. He took pictures. He produced a receipt. Colton scanned it. Brandon stood there with a hand on his hip, satisfied. He did not understand he had just been made the person who would accept liability for any check he tried to write against my name. Paper is the quietest trap ever invented. When they left, Colton and I sat again in the truck. He said, "That was easy." I said, "Nothing about any of this is easy. People think you get rich by doing sharp things. Mostly you get rich because you do dull things in the same direction for too long. It bores everyone else into quitting." The next morning, Lila posted a honeymoon photo that looked like an advertisement for a beach without bugs. She captioned it, "Building a Family Empire." I made coffee and thought of termites. I texted Claire, "Pancakes at 11. She replied with a heart, the bruise kind again. At the diner, she tried again for the key bowl tone. She asked for my online banking login, like she was asking for the salt. I laughed once. She went red. "Dad," she said, "I am not trying to take anything." I said, "Then don't take anything." She put her fork down so gently it might as well have been a threat. She said, "Brandon is worried you'll mess something up." I said, "Your brother has spent his whole life mistaking my silence for confusion." A week later, the first invoice hit Brandon's inbox. It wore the suit of a security retainer he had authorized. It was not a trick bill. It was market rate. It was even fair. His reply to the vendor included the words, "My father's account," that looked like a confession if you read slowly. The vendor is a real company with a desk, and a woman named Marta who answers the phone like she carries the weight of it on her shoulder. Marta kept the email. Marta keeps everything. Colton said, "They'll try to fix this by overreaching." He said it like a man reading tomorrow's weather from last year's almanac. He was right. People who panic don't step back. They step forward, faster, harder, onto thinner ice. The second invoice went to Lila, a service estimate for a security camera upgrade. Her reply was longer, emotional, demanding. She CC'd Brandon. She CC'd me. She used the word unauthorized 5 times. Every time she wrote it, it got less true. Brandon tried calling. I let it ring. He left a message that started with Dad and ended with "Please call me back," which is how children speak when they finally see the edge of the cliff. Colton and I met again at the kitchen table. He said, "They'll escalate." I said, "Yes." He said, "What do you want them to lose?" I said, "Just enough to understand the price of assuming." He nodded, folded the plot plan, and said, "Then we wait." Waiting is the part no one respects. They think revenge is a sprint. It's a calendar. It's a season. It's the slow tightening of a jar lid someone else loosened, then forgot about, then struggles to open years later and blames the jar. I drank my coffee. I watched the sun move across the same floorboards I installed myself. I thought of screws and threads and the way wood remembers every pressure ever applied to it. Public collapse is tiny clicks. I could already hear the next one forming. Action scene 1, the apartment night. We staged the second break-in on a Friday when neighbors are too tired to be brave. The plan was a conversation with a soundtrack. Brandon arrived faster. He brought no friend this time. He had the tight face of a man who has already Googled how to unring a bell. He knocked and went in with the confidence of a landlord pretending to respect privacy laws. I was in the hallway with Colton and a plainclothes officer I knew from inspecting municipal jobs. I wasn't dragging cops into a family drama. I was making sure the drama stayed inside the lines. The officer's job was to stand there, arms crossed, and be very bored while legality did its slow work. Brandon stormed into my kitchen and started narrating his help. "Dad, We're adding another patrol, he said. We're putting cameras in. We're switching your mail to our place for safety. He was half shouting so the clouds would hear him. I let him finish. Then I took out a folder. I laid out copies of the authorization he had signed. I laid out a letter from my attorney formalizing his temporary responsibility for security vendors he selected without my consent. I laid out the invoices he had already approved. He stared. He did the math the way a man counts cards after the dealer has shuffled. Security cameras, I said, are fine. Switching my mail is a crime. Touch my mail and you will spend a night you will remember, and I will not visit. He opened his mouth. He closed it. Colton stepped in. He said, Mr. Hale, the patrol will continue under your personal authorization. Nothing will be billed to your father, and any commitments made in writing by you will be paid by you. That is what you signed. Brandon looked to me like I could wave a wand over the table. I said, You want to run things? Here you go. His shoulders fell an inch. In that inch, our whole history shifted. He said, This isn't fair. I said, Son, fair is an open book. You tried to steal the book. You slapped the librarian on your way out. He looked small then, and I hated that I still loved him. Love is a nail that never rusts. I don't recommend it. On his way out, Lila called. The speaker lit the room. She said, Did you get the keys? He said, No. She said a word that echoed off my cabinets. Then she said, Fine, burn him to the ground. Brandon did not realize phones have memories. You can talk yourself into a lot of mercy with daughters. They look at you with the face they used when they were 5 and wanted ice cream at 9 in the morning. The face full of certainty that the world can bend, that rules are only suggestions, that a parent is simply a vending machine with a heartbeat. But the world turns everyone into adults with bills, and the charm that once opened every door now only rattles the knob. You learn, sooner or later, that love does not mean surrender, and mercy does not mean blindness. Claire came over on a bright afternoon with a bakery box and news. The light was sharp, the kind of day when dust motes look like gold coins in the air, when every surface seems to confess how long it has been since you polished it. She let herself in the way she always has. No knock, a breezy hello. The assumption that my space was still her playground. She had taken a job with a startup that turns private homes into event spaces, which is a nice way of saying it makes neighborhoods loud for money. She said my apartment would photograph well. She stood in my living room and spread her arms and said, Imagine. I imagined strangers spilling red wine on 80-year-old hot pine, shoes grinding grit into boards that had already survived 3 presidents and 1 hurricane. I imagined the inevitable broken glass that would escape discovery and wait barefoot for me at 3 in the morning. I imagined her smile, bright, confident, the smile of someone who believes consequences are theoretical. And then I imagined I was done imagining her as innocent. I asked about her fiancé. She said Brady was traveling. I said, often. She confessed they had paused their date. Paused is a word you use when you don't want your face to know you are lying. It pretends patience where there is only abandonment. She said it like she was putting something on a shelf, something she could take down later, when things were calmer, when life was kinder, when he finally realized she was the prize he would never find again. I heard it for what it was, a door closing, without the courtesy of a latch. I told her about the invoices Brandon had authorized. She blinked like I was talking in a frequency she could not hear. She didn't even try to deny it, which was worse. It meant she knew, or should have known, but preferred the numbness of willful ignorance. Then she tried one last soft theft. She asked for my banking login in a voice used for goodnight stories, the voice that once asked for fairy tales and now asked for access codes. I laughed again and then hated myself for how much it sounded like my father laughing at me when I was young and stupid, when I thought I could barter affection for permission. I said, Claire, I love you, and I am finished being easy. You will not touch my mail. You will not touch my accounts. You will not touch my keys. There was no anger in my voice, only the weight of a door being locked from the inside. She pitched the bakery box into the trash with a little flick, the gesture of a woman who has never needed to clean up after herself, and was out the door, heels loud on the old floor, each step a punctuation mark that said, "Ungrateful, ungrateful, ungrateful." 2 days later, someone from her company contacted my building association about listing my apartment for pop-up events. The email forwarded to me, as if the universe wanted to make sure I didn't miss the punchline. I replied as if I were my own property manager, which, in truth, I am. I wrote, "The unit is not available for any commercial use." Attached were bylaws and a notice reminding any party to cease and desist solicitation. I signed with a name that had authority, even if it was just mine written in a different font. Claire called me using the tone of a lawyer she had not hired, a tone that wore confidence like a rented suit. She said, "You embarrassed me." I said, "You embarrassed yourself." She said, "You will regret this." I said, "I already do." There was a silence after that, the kind that isn't empty, but crowded with every word neither of us had the courage to say. We hung up before any of them escaped. Colton checked the startup. He found founders who burn through interns like kindling. He found a deck promising investors a pipeline of properties that did not exist. He found numbers standing on stilts, wobbling beneath the weight of half-truths. He did not need to dig. He just read. The company had the glossy desperation of a house staged for a buyer that will never arrive. Even the testimonials sounded like they had been written by someone who had never held a real conversation, just rearranged phrases from an optimism thesaurus. Next, the gossip. I had avoided it my entire life, but revenge is a dirty game played in clean gloves. I did not signal. I did not plant lies. I handed a small set of truths to someone who traffics in them for free. 1. Claire tried to list a property she does not own. 2. Brady had been on 2 dates with a woman who posts inspirational quotes under pictures of her knees. 3. The startup had used the city's logo on a slide without permission. I spoke softly, and the world did the shouting for me. The city's communication office sent a stern note. Claire's company scrubbed the slide. Brady scrubbed his account. Claire scrubbed me. When she showed up crying at my door at midnight, I let her in. I made tea. The kettle hissed like it was tired of witnessing human repetition. She said, "It's all falling apart." I said, "That's gravity." She said, "Help me." I said, "I will help you the way I help a beam. If you carry your share, I will not let you sag. If you try to be the roof and the floor, I will cut you out." She slept on my couch. In the morning, she was gone. She took nothing but the teaspoon she liked to fidget with, the one with the dent in the handle from years of anxious thumb pressure. The spoon was in her purse. I know because she sent a picture from a cafe, the spoon on the saucer, captioned with a heart. That was the last heart I got. But stories do not end just because tenderness does. The aftermath has its own plot, quieter but no less sharp. Days passed, and the silence rearranged the furniture in my head. I kept expecting her to call, not to apologize, but to negotiate reality into a shape that better suited her. She didn't. That was its own kind of apology, the unspoken kind, the kind that says, "I won't make it worse, but I also won't make it right." The building association reached out again, this time to ask whether I wanted them to draft a formal response policy. I said no. I'm old enough to know that the point of a boundary is not the paperwork, it is the willingness to enforce it. And I was willing now, more than ever. Age, it turns out, is not just the accumulation of years, it is the slow crystallization of a spine. I walked past the trash where she'd thrown the bakery box. I pulled it out days later, curious. Inside were 4 pastries, 2 almond croissants, a cinnamon twist, and a small, perfect lemon tart. The croissants were stale. The twist had hardened into a question mark of sugar and regret. The tart, wrapped more carefully than the others, had survived. I ate it standing over the sink, like a confession I wasn't ready to speak aloud. It tasted like something made with care for someone who wouldn't notice. I wanted to believe the tart meant something, that she had brought it because she remembered it was my favorite, that, in some corner of her, I was still the father worth baking for. But the truth is simpler. She brought pastries because it made her entrance look generous. The tart wasn't a symbol, it was a prop. The older I get, the more I understand that love is not measured in grand gestures, but in what someone does after they don't get their way. Claire, when denied, chose demolition. Not screaming, not pleading, just subtraction. She removed herself, her voice, her future calls for favors, an exit disguised as punishment. Meanwhile, I relearned the rooms of my own life. I stopped checking my phone for her name. I stopped rehearsing arguments in the shower. I fixed the loose cabinet door she always said she would get to. I brewed tea in the morning for one, and the quiet wasn't an ache anymore. It was a chair finally free of coats. A month later, Colton sent me an update. The startup was wobbling. Investors asked questions. Interns leaked screenshots. A rival platform filed a complaint. The founders wrote long emails full of pivot and restructure and runway extension. I read them like a man watching a storm hit a house he once warned someone not to buy. I didn't send the news to Claire, not out of kindness, out of clarity. She already knew. People like her feel collapse before the headlines confirm it. They sense the temperature drop in rooms others still think are warm. It's why they're always running, towards something shinier, or away from something burning. Eventually, I went to the cafe where she had taken the spoon. I sat outside. The tables were wrought iron, painted white, chipping in places like they were tired of pretending to be new. I ordered a tea I didn't want. I watched the door, not expecting her, just learning the shape of waiting without hope. A barista asked if I needed anything else. I said no. I already had what I came for, proof that life goes on even when the people you built it for walk away with the silverware. The spoon never came back. Neither did she. And I learned slowly that you can love someone without making them your heir, that you can forgive without reopening the door, that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a grown child is to stop cushioning the fall they keep scheduling for themselves. And so the story did not end with a reunion or a lesson she thanked me for. It ended the way most real stories end, with two people walking in different directions, each convinced they understand the past better than the other, each shaping the memory to fit the version of themselves they can live with. I do not fault her for that. We all curate our ghosts. Hers just happened to live in nicer apartments. As for me, I keep the dented teaspoon in a drawer with the other mismatched cutlery life hands you. Things that don't belong, but stay anyway. Some objects are reminders. Others are warnings. This one is both. I still love her. That part never changes. But love without obedience to reality is just a story we tell to keep from noticing the floorboards are rotting, and I am done falling through. Action Scene 2. Auction Day. Lila and Brandon thought they found a lever. The old commercial unit, the one with the stubborn tenant and the peeling paint that hides thick walls, came up for a tax-related auction. Not a fraud, not an IRS trick, a routine city process for minor arrears, manufactured by timing. My attorney and I had engineered a squeak that would invite interference. Lila arrived at the courthouse in a white suit, like the story needed a villain in a bright costume. Brandon wore a navy jacket that looked borrowed from a rich friend. They had a plan that involved bidding and flipping, and a podcast later where they would tell people how to be bold. I stood in the back with Colton and a woman from my attorney's office who can turn sentences into traps and call them footnotes. The auctioneer wore a tie with small anchors on it and the patience of a saint who has a parking meter about to expire. He called the parcel number. Lila raised her hand, then her voice, like both were microphones. She bid. Another bidder countered. She bid again. The numbers rose in a clean line to the exact spot where a reasonable person would stop. She did not. Brandon put a hand on her wrist. She shook it off. A blogger with a camera phone started filming, the way people film small fires in trash cans. The gavel fell. The room made a sound like a choke. Lila smiled at her phone. Then the auctioneer said the words she did not expect because she had not read anything. He said, "Sale is subject to any existing lease agreements and liens and any liabilities incurred by the purchaser." My attorney's woman took a step forward and delivered a letter that confirmed the lease would outlive all of us. It also confirmed a maintenance obligation tied, by a paragraph Lila would never read, to the purchaser's personal guarantee because the bid had been placed by an individual, not an LLC. Brandon's face changed shapes. Lila kept smiling the way a person smiles with only the top half of their face. Then the tenant stood up in the back, a man in a denim jacket with hands like pliers. He said, "Nice to meet you, landlord." He had brought a list of repairs that would cost more than a wedding suit and their honeymoon combined. The list was not a surprise to anyone who can read a wall. The blogger pointed the camera. Lila tried to take it. The camera moved away the way smoke does. Brandon said, "Off the record." The blogger laughed. Colton stepped in, voice low. He said, "You signed a guarantor clause in an email, Brandon. You used the words 'my father's account' in writing. A vendor kept the thread. If you try to move this to me, you will be paying a different kind of bill." Lila said, "We will sue." The attorney's woman said, "Please do." She said it like a blessing. Outside, the air smelled like damp paper. Lila's heel snapped on a loose stone. She cursed the sidewalk. Brandon tried to help her and she shook him off like a scarf. A small crowd watched the way people watch a soap opera in a laundromat. I did not film it. I have seen enough proof to know you never need more than what you can carry in one hand. That night, the video of the white suit, the snapped heel, the list of repairs, and the gavel speech appeared on 3 feeds that Lila cared about more than heat in January. The comments were the wet teeth of strangers. Brandon called me at midnight and said, "Make it stop." I said, "You started it." He said, "You made the conditions." I said, "You provided the weather." He hung up. The silence after a slam is the finest music. All stories end in a room. Courtrooms, bedrooms, hospital rooms. Ours ended in a warehouse that smells like motors and dust, with a roof high enough to let secrets echo. Brandon asked to meet. He said it would be just us. He sounded like a man who has finally noticed the cliff. He chose the warehouse because he thought it would give him movie points for grit. I chose to say yes because I like honest flaws. I arrived alone, which is a lie you tell with your body. Colton was 2 minutes behind me and never far. I stepped into the dim and waited by a stack of pallets that looked like a cheap cathedral. Brandon came out of the shadow with his hand open and his jaw angry. Lila came with him, hard smile, back in place. 2 men I did not know stayed close enough to be counted, but far enough to pretend they were not there. Brandon said, "Sign a transfer." He waved a folder. He said, "We end this now." I said, "Or what?" He said, "Or we go to the press." I said, "You're already there." Lila said, "You won't keep friends after this." I said, "I don't have the kind of friends that watch me get slapped and clap." One of the men stepped closer. He said, "We're just here to make sure everyone behaves." He had the voice of a man who thinks sleeves make him invincible. Colton's steps echoed like the start of weather. He came in calm. He said, "That's enough." The men turned like dogs catching a bigger scent. Brandon held up the folder like a shield. He said, "Sign it." I said, "I brought something better." I took out a small recorder and set it on a crate. Lila snorted. I hit play. Her voice filled the space, saying the words "fine, burn him to the ground." The acoustics in the warehouse did her no favors. Her vowels piled up heavy as tires. I said, "You planned to remove my mail. You attempted to transfer assets you did not own. You placed bids you did not understand. You authorized vendors under my name and set yourself as guarantor. You did these things on tape, in email, in front of witnesses, and you did them while smiling for cameras. Brandon swiped for the recorder. Colton moved faster. He put one hand on Brandon's wrist and pressed. Not cruel. Firm. Things in Brandon's face changed shades. The other two men stepped in a half pace. Colton looked at them and said, "Do not." They did not. Lila said, "We can undo this. You just want us to apologize." She said apology like it was a disease. I said, "I want an end." I took out a second folder. This one held agreements drafted by my attorney that would make official what had already happened in practice. Brandon would accept the debt he had authorized. Lila would relinquish any claim to keys she never had. Claire, who was not there, would be notified that any attempt to list any property in my name would trigger an automatic restraining order. It was boring, which is how you know it is powerful. Lila laughed at the word debt. She said, "We'll file bankruptcy." I said, "You can, but this obligation is not dischargeable under the terms you created when you guaranteed a commercial maintenance schedule with your name." She blinked as if the room had tilted. Brandon looked at me then, at the exact human angle where sons look at fathers and think, "What did you build with those hands that I never noticed?" He said, "Dad, please." I said, "I was invisible at your wedding. I'm visible now." He said, "You're hurting us." I said, "You did not scrape your knee. You broke into a person. You hit him. You invited witnesses. You wrote it down." Lila tried a last rush. She stepped in and went for the recorder again. Colton's shoulder slid and she met a wall of muscle that is mostly patience. She stumbled back, not hurt, just surprised. The warehouse filled with the kind of quiet that follows a siren. And then, from the door, came another set of steps. Claire. She looked wrecked in the soft way of people who have not slept in the same bed 2 nights in a row for a week. She said, "Dad." Her voice cracked on the consonants. She said, "I'm sorry." The words were pebbles in her mouth. I said, "You tried to sell my house for parties." She said, "I know." I looked at all 3 of them, and in my chest something old and cold shifted and locked. You do not stop loving your children. You stop letting them steer. I said, "Here is the deal. You sign. You live small for a while. You work. Real jobs. Not jobs where your job is you. You pay back what you tried to spend of mine. You keep my name out of your mouths." "And we are done." Lila said, "Never." Brandon said nothing. Claire cried like a faucet left on. Colton stood there, a piece of furniture you could lean on. I put the pen on the folder. I said, "This is the last time I offer anything with a soft edge." The warehouse door banged in the wind. Somewhere, a chain clinked against metal. Brandon picked up the pen. Signing is not action. It is the end of action. But there are finishes that require more than paper. Endings that need weight, need gesture, need the gravity of a body in motion to seal what ink alone cannot. The room, if you could call that drafty warehouse corner a room, was full of those finishes, full of the last quiet seconds before consequences become permanent, before the future stops being a theory and becomes a bill of sale with names and dates and the residue of pride. Lila knocked the pen out of Brandon's hand. It clattered like a brass insect, legs kicking against a surface too smooth for grip. The sound echoed, thin and metallic, ricocheting off the corrugated walls, as if even the air wanted to protest. She shoved the folder. The papers slid and fanned and skated off the pallet like leaves in a gutter, edges fluttering in a draft that smelled of dust and oil and rain waiting in the clouds. She said, "He is weak. He will fold." Brandon did not move. That was the first surprise. His eyes were wet and furious in equal parts, the kind of fury that is exhausted before it even starts, like a match already damp. He looked at me, and then at her, and in that swivel of his gaze, you could see the boy and the man wrestling for the same skull. Then he bent, picked up the pen again. The motion was slow, and because it was slow, it was unbreakable. He signed. The loop of the B was a little shaky, but it landed. He handed the pen to Claire. She took it like it might bite and signed. She did not look up, not at me, not at him, not at the future she was now tethered to with her own hand. Lila stared at both of them like they had changed languages mid-sentence. Her mouth opened. A word tried to be born. It died instead. She said, "I am not signing that." I said, "You do not have to. Your name is not on what you tried to take. Your name is not on what he purchased. Your name will be loud in other rooms." She came at me then, not with fists, with words that would peel paint if the paint had feelings. She called me small. She called me cruel. She called me a man who does not understand love, the way a drowning person calls the ocean unkind. She called me a man who could not hold a wife and does not deserve children. I said, "I held a beam over your heads your whole life. You tried to pull the nails out." The two men shifted like a wave, thinking about breaking, but they did not break. They were hired presents, the kind of men who have shoulders like furniture and faces like blank receipts. Colton did not raise his hands. He did not need to. His stillness was a shield. I took a step forward, because there are moments in a person's life when you move the way you wish someone had moved for you when you were young. I took Lila's wrist with my left hand and her shoulder with my right, and I turned her, gently but with enough force to remove choice from the room, and I guided her back 3 steps and set her against a crate. It was physical. It was controlled. It was exactly as much as it needed to be, no more, no less. Her breath hitched with a sound as honest as truth. I said, "You do not touch me again. You do not speak to me again. You will leave this family with what you brought into it." She stared at me with new eyes. Not fear. Recognition. I was not the old man you could slap between courses. I was the wall, and walls do not apologize for being immovable. Colton gathered the papers and squared them in the folder with a carpenter's pride, thumbs stroking the edges like a man who knows the value of alignment. He handed it to me. I slipped it into the inside pocket of my jacket, where I keep the things I will not drop. Brandon said, "Dad." I said, "No." He shut his mouth. Sometimes no is not a refusal. Sometimes it is a tourniquet. We moved toward the door in a slow tide, the kind that takes sand with it. Lila lunged one last time, grabbing for the folder. Colton blocked without looking, a door that knew its hinges. One of the men tried to be brave and met a forearm that taught him to be humble. The other decided the parking lot was more interesting than this conversation. Wisdom can be late, but it still counts if it arrives before the ambulance. We stepped into the grey daylight. The sky was the colour of old zinc, dull and bruised. I could taste the rain that would come at evening, that metallic promise in the air. The city hummed without caring, wires trembling with their own errands, pigeons negotiating their own treaties. A car pulled up crooked. The driver's door flew open. Evelyn stepped out with her hair tied back and the eyes she saved for the day she left me. She had been quiet through all of this, storing her opinions like canned goods, the kind that dent but never burst. She looked past me at our children. She looked at their faces the way a mechanic looks at a car that no longer deserves a garage. She said to them, "You don't come back from this," Claire whispered. "Mom," a word as thin as tracing paper. Evelyn shook her head once, like a small hammer tapping a nail flush. Then she looked at me and said, "Are we done?" I said yes. She nodded. She turned to Lila and said, "You picked the wrong old man." The wind shifted. Somewhere behind us a door slammed like a period. Lila shouted something about lawyers, but even her voice sounded like it was being evicted from the day. Brandon called after me once, "Dad, wait." Claire sobbed that thin sob that always sounds like apology, even when it isn't. Her shoulders shook like a house being tested by wind. I kept walking. At the threshold of the warehouse, the notary from the wedding stepped out from the shadow like a bad habit. He had followed his own curiosity to the end of the block, the way some men follow dogs or rumors. He said, "That your signature package, Mr. Hale?" I said, "It is." He said, "Do you need a witness?" I looked at my children. I looked at the woman who used to share my house and my sink and my Sundays. I looked at Colton, who had shown up when I needed someone who could stand very still while weather changed people. I said, "I have all I need." Brandon made a last run, half-step into a world where he could reverse things and be a better man without doing any work. His shoe slipped on the threshold. He stumbled forward with a cry that was more boy than man. I caught his elbow with the hand that used to lift him into pickup trucks when he was small. I held him. He looked at me, eyes wet, mouth open on a word he could not say. I let go. Behind me, a forklift started with a rumble. A worker yelled something about the gate. The day moved on, indifferent to family drama in its yard, because days are union men with no overtime clause for heartbreak. I put the folder in the passenger seat of my truck. I got in. I started the engine. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw 3 figures in a row like bad actors who finally understand the script. Lila lunged for the door and missed. Brandon reached for the handle and touched air. Claire lifted her hand and then dropped it to her side, like it belonged to a tired woman in a long painting. I rolled forward. When my front wheels crossed the seam in the concrete, Colton stepped into their line of sight the way a curtain falls. He did not look back. He did not salute. He just existed like a landmark you cannot argue with. I pressed the accelerator. The truck moved like a decision. I did not wave. We cleared the lot. The street opened. I turned on the blinker out of habit, because order is what keeps people safe when feeling is loud. A bicyclist cut past, eyes on his own private clock. The light changed. I went with it. On the seat beside me, the folder sat quiet and heavy as a newborn. Paper, ink, the mathematics of consequence. No screams, no vows, no applause, just the arithmetic of signatures and the silence that comes afterward. At the corner, Evelyn pulled up beside me. She looked over. She nodded once. Not love, not even forgiveness. Respect. We were 2 carpenters who had taken down a rotten porch. We were sore and done. That is its own kind of peace, the kind you can sleep beside without dreaming of knives. I turned right. The city opened like a clean hallway. Behind me, a family that had tried to steal a life stood in a useless doorway. In front of me, air. I did not look back. I had raised them. That job was over. Some jobs do not end with applause. They end with receipts. I drove into the afternoon. The engine sound a low and steady thing, like a heart doing what it should after a long sprint. I could feel the years behind me, like stacked lumber, cut, carried, weathered, used. Some beams still strong, some warped, all accounted for. The road widened. The rain finally broke, soft at first, then steady, a baptism for no one in particular. I let the wipers do their work. I kept my hands at 10 and 2. I did not speak. There are victories that sound like defeat until time translates them. The folder shifted with the curve of the street, a small reminder that even settled things move. I rested my hand on it for a moment, not to protect it, but to acknowledge it. A life's worth of teaching, and a single afternoon of proof that lessons are not always learned. I drove on. The world did not care. The world never does. That is why we build our own walls, make our own rules, sign our own names, and walk away when the ink is dry. That was the only ceremony we ever truly get. I did not look back.